Ladies and gentlemen, it's the return of History Revision, but this time we are doing Vietnam.
I still don't like this music.
You love this music?
I don't like it. It's not my choice. I blame him.
Welcome to some more revision.
Hello there.
If you're new, hello, I'm Will.
And I'm Connor. Still.
Right, hello, welcome to History Revision Vietnam. Today we're going to be kicking off with the reasons for US involvement, sticking to the AQA
I believe so.
specification. We're following the specs, so go with it. We're covering years 61 to 63. That's only 2 years, however, technically 3.
Nice
but
maths.
there we go, yeah. But it's a lot to cover. And we're going to kick off with the situation in Vietnam. No, let's put a little bit of the context in. You don't need to know it, but you kind of need...
It's just a bit of a nice reading.
Right. Very, very brief context with Connor Durkin.
Right. Vietnam is an interesting country because for millennia it fought off the Chinese. The Chinese would invade, the Vietnamese would sort of bond together and sort of form guerrilla warfare and kick the Chinese out. Then in the 1840s it was overtaken by France and then became a colony. Then when France got its arse kicked in World War II, 41 I believe, it then became a Japanese colony because they invaded. When the Japanese got nuked in 1945, then the French took over again. And that's pretty much where we left off, apart from the Viet Minh, which were a sort of guerrilla movement, fighting the French out of Vietnam in sort of the mid-late 50s. There you go.
Right, and a little bit of context in America is that you need to know that there's 2 different parties you can have in America, the Democrats and the Republicans.
Republicans are bad.
An example of a Democrat president was President Truman, who was the president in power when China fell to communism, and he was blamed for being a communist sympathiser, and he was blamed partly for the loss of China, and he was a Democrat, and so all the Democrats were sort of were blamed for being communist sympathisers, which is a bad thing in America, really, if you want to simplify it.
At this point, communism was like the worst thing you could be called.
It was really, and that's what's called the McCarthyism era, because Joe McCarthy, I believe
so.
was the Republican that was basically getting people arrested for being communist sympathisers, even if they weren't. Read The Crucible, good little book. I
agree.
And yeah, and so into the presidency. In November 1960, in the election, Kennedy, a Democrat, wins against Richard Nixon. That's not the last we'll see of him.
Good old Dickie.
Good old...
Tricky
Dicky. But he won very narrowly. There's been a slight controversy about whether he cheated.
Yes.
Some dead people may have voted. But he's the last Democrat in the White House. Before him was Truman, whose career was obviously damaged by the fall of China. So... The Democrats have been labelled weak on communism, and so as he comes in, he has to take an aggressive line to make himself look, strong to the US public as well as to the rest of the world. So he wanted to turn Democrat weakness into a strength, is what I have written in front of me. That's all very good.
Basically, he wanted to sort of overcompensate for weakness in policy against communism by really, really kicking communism out of the world, is what he wanted to do eventually.
Tiny little bit more context. In 1957, the feeling of safety that Eisenhower had with the US having loads of nuclear weapons and the communists, which is Russia and obviously China at the time, didn't. The feeling was shattered in 1957 with Sputnik, which was the first artificial satellite into space by...
the Russians.
Or the USSR, with the Soviet Union, basically. Russians. Which could mean that they had intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Or at least the technology to do so.
Yeah, which means they could shoot America, really. They could be directly targeted.
Lol.
Other little things you need to know. You need to know about NATO, which is in defending Western Europe.
North Atlantic Treaty Organisation.
Yes, basically. It's like an agreement against... Well, just an agreement in Europe, really.
Against communism.
The Stalin's dead by now, I believe.
Yes.
1960. And Nikita Khrushchev is now the leader of the Soviet Union.
Indeed.
And he's saying that they can create atom bombs like sausages.
Yeah.
The only man that knows that there isn't a problem is Eisenhower because of espionage or spying and U-2 planes, but he can't say that he knows that because that's against international
U2, not
law.
the band, I will just point out. They are
Not
big
the band.
planes that go up high in the sky and spy.
1959 to 60, JFK turns defence into attack over Richard Nixon. He says that there's a dangerous missile gap against America and the government cannot defend this, and the idea took her. That's how he came into power, really, by saying there was a missile gap, even though he knew that there wasn't.
Yes.
Or he found out that there wasn't when he came
He
into power.
lied.
January 1961, JFK is made president. A little bit of background, he's an intellectual.
Catholic.
His cabinet is the best and the brightest. His Secretary of State is...
Robert... Oh, hand.
Oh no,
State.
Dean Rusk.
Dean Rusk, sorry.
The Secretary of Defence, Connor.
is Robert McNamara.
Robert McNamara, who is
good.
presented with a missile gap. Kennedy basically says, so what about the missile gap and how big is it, etc. And McNamara says, there isn't one.
They're going to nuke us.
Yes.
Or they could.
In November 1960, on JFK's first day, Eisenhower told him that he would probably have to go to war, and probably in Laos.
That's a nice little encouraging statement to
Yes.
actually start a new job.
Laos had a royal government at the time, led by... It just doesn't matter, he just did. And Kennedy's advisors said that Laos was not the ideal place because it's landlocked and Laotians are a bunch of wimps. I have
Apparently
written
so.
here. In May 1961, talks are agreed leading to the neutralisation of Laos, leading to power sharing between royalist, neutralist and communist forces in May 1961. Right, next little section, the context of the Cold War and reasons why Kennedy administration intervened. There are 3 things, or technically 4, but we'll go 3. Bay of Pigs, Vienna Summit, Berlin, and... what's the other one? There's another one.
Yeah,
It'll come to me.
Yeah.
Right, Bay of Pigs, Connor,
Bay
very
of
quickly.
Pigs was an attempted operation by the US Marines against the communist government of Cuba, led by Fidel Castro, who is actually still alive, or is on his way out, so you know. They basically tried to overthrow the entire government by sending about, I think it's around 2,000 Marines. They got their asses handed to them. And that was a really big, screw up for the Kennedy government. Like, the first thing he ever did was to completely lose a military operation, which therefore highlighted his weaknesses, because he didn't really plan that well, and just made him look weak in general. So then he felt he even had to compensate even more, because he's mucked up.
And this is in April 1961 when the Cuban exile brigades land in Cuba. It's important to say that this wasn't Kennedy's idea, wasn't his plan. He inherited this from the Eisenhower administration.
True.
I believe. And, yeah.
Very true.
So, yeah, Kennedy won't send in troops into Cuba, and so the exiles surrender. And...
sorry, not Marines. It's Marine-trained Cuban forces who are
yes,
against
it was
the
a Cuban
communists.
forces. No actual US people, but it was really obvious that the US had been kind of behind it. As a result, he took personal responsibility, and he sacked the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles, and this left Kennedy suspicious and cautious about the military and CIA advice after this point, which comes to be significant. The second thing that happened in 1961, the poor bloke, is in June, there was the Vienna Summit, which is JFK was due to meet with the Russians at Vienna, but Khrushchev didn't rate him at all. And he can't believe that they didn't send troops to the Bay of Pigs, and he saw him as a wimp, basically.
Really?
And Kennedy came away, arguably, wanting to prove himself.
And is this not the same point at which JFK questioned communism in front of Khrushchev, and then Khrushchev sort of hammered him into the ground with his argument? He's very eloquent, very well-worded arguments.
Even
and
though
it's
he's
sort of,
Russian.
Yeah. So,
Good video to
translator
YouTube
in there at
actually.
some point.
Yeah. So, that's 2 things already in 1961. I've got Berlin here as well. The Berlin Wall.
In Germany.
At Vienna, one issue that Khrushchev had raised was Berlin. In 1958, obviously, Russia had planned to sign a treaty with East Germany, and it was agreed that Berlin's status would be discussed in May 1960 in Paris. But then the U-2 plane, this is important, you can see this in the Cold War documentary, it's very good. A U-2 plane was shot down in Russia because they were spying on them, and the Russians walked out of the summit. Which is never good.
Naughty Americans.
People going to Berlin are walking to the west side from the east, which is Russian controlled, to the west side, which is...
capitalist. Sort of joint American funded, really.
Yeah, American and in Europe. France had a bit, Britain had a bit. Claiming asylum, this happened in a flood, and in August 1961, Khrushchev decided to build a wall. So by the end of 1961, there have been the Bay of Pigs, Vienna, the Berlin Wall, and South Vietnam President Ngo Diem has the problems thus. In 1959, North Vietnam aids communists in the south, and in 1960, the National Liberation Front is formed.
How dare you call me a
And
flant?
they are the people with the military arm of the National Liberation Front. If you think of the NLF as being like a party or a political
Woo, party!
thing, then the military arm is the Viet Cong.
Min at this point, Cong later on.
Viet Cong, yeah. They
Just a little
become the
point,
Viet
they were
Cong.
never actually called the Viet Cong. The Americans called them that because it was shortened from Vietnamese Communist and they couldn't bother to be pronouncing.
Also called Charlie.
Yeah.
The
You see.
actions and policies of President Kennedy. So he's in Vietnam now, really. Or he's not in Vietnam, but Vietnam's becoming more and more of a problem. And South Vietnam was the USA's ally. It says here, in the Cold War context, it again isn't very impressive. It also had implications for Vietnam, and Ngo Dinh Diem expressed concerns at this, just generally about what was happening. The communists from the North Vietnam can come into the South through Laos, making communist containment harder, and JFK will now have to take a tougher line in South Vietnam.
When it says communist containment, I think there was a theory first put about by Eisenhower called domino theory, which is very prevalent in the argument for staying in Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, what they're saying is China's fallen to communism. If you let Vietnam and then Laos and then Cambodia fall to communism, it's like dominoes falling over each time.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually the whole of Asia will be communist, and then that threatens the US in a very direct way.
Yeah.
Just a little side note
And you might get a question on whether you think, on one of the justification questions, on whether certain presidents believed in the domino theory, and you can bring up all these different arguments. In May 1961, Vice President Lyndon Johnson,
Very
you'll hear
important later.
is sent to Southeast Asia to reassure Diem about Laos. Johnson describes Diem as the Winston Churchill of Southeast Asia, and he comes back
Lies.
convinced of the need for a firm stand and as a supporter of Diem. This doesn't matter at the moment, as the Vice President was made to get votes from South USA. Arguably, Lyndon Johnson was brought in just so Kennedy should get some votes from Texas. And
From the
so
Deep South.
he's useless, and they just arguably should put him over to Vietnam to
Indeed.
get rid of him for a while. In October 1961, the Taylor Rostov, or is it Rostow?
Rostov.
Really? Rostov mission to report on the status
Of South Vietnam.
led by General Taylor and Walt Rostow. It is Rostow.
Oh, you spelt it wrong.
The National Security Advisor. That's who Walt
Rostow.
Rostow is. They come back pessimistically, saying that the North are penetrating the South,
Giggity.
and there should be US aid and even troops. They recommend 8,000 flood control officers. And the Minister of Defence,
I know this.
Robert McNamara,
Minister of
says...
Defence, that's the British one. Secretary of Defence.
Secretary of Defence say that it should be up to 100,000. It's the sort of the slippery slope, very Church of England argument that if you start putting a few in, it will continuously going. And arguably, he was right. Kennedy said no, and he never said yes.
Never say
That's a good
yes.
argument. But he did decide to undertake all measures short of direct involvement with more money, equipment, and advisors.
Advisors in little inverted commas there, seeing as he
The
did
decision to give more money for the ARVN...
the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which is South Vietnamese Army.
Giving them APCs... or
Jungle tanks.
and helicopters.
What is that? Jungle tanks.
That's roughly what APCs are.
Armoured personnel carriers like tanks but with people in them.
Thank you. From Eisenhower, there were fewer than 800 advisors. This is good stats. By December 1961, 800 became 3,000. By the end of 1962...
3,000 had become 11,000.
And by November 1963...
When Kennedy was assassinated,
there were 16,000.
That's a bit more than advising, if you ask me.
And most of them were part of the American Special Forces Green Berets, teaching counterinsurgency.
Green.
This included an entire helicopter battalion who are now accompanying the ARVN on missions, so US casualties right. Very quickly, about the Green Berets, it was meant to be JFK's thing. He was really into counterinsurgency, and apparently he even had a Green Beret on his desk in the Oval Office.
Yes, he did. And I will just point out, with his helicopters, they sent loads and loads of sort of mechanised infantry divisions and whatnot. And they also sent loads of helicopters, but they were constantly denying they had any involvement in it at the time. There's a really nice little thing where there was a US reporter in the docks in South Vietnam, and all these helicopters came in underneath these tarps. And then she sort of asked this general, "Oh, what are those helicopters doing?" And the general just goes, "I don't see nothing."
Oh yeah, nice example. Jungle issues. The problem is that they're simply hiding in the jungle, really.
Yes.
So herbicides are used and defoliants to destroy the jungle, authorised by Kennedy in November 1961.
Like
Very
Agent.
busy year, 1961
Yeah.
for Kennedy. At first it's in the jungle, along borders and rivers, and then in 1962 it's even used on crops.
And the defoliants, one you might know is Agent Orange, which has since then caused massive...
Yeah, been linked to cancer.
Yeah, cancer and massive disfigurements in children in
Yep.
Vietnam now.
This is called Operation Ranch Hand.
Stupid name.
You're going to hear some ridiculous names like
Rolling
Duck Hook
Thunder.
later. Right, so Operation Ranch Hand, and
19 million gallons of herbicides are poured onto the countryside. 11 million gallons of which was Agent Orange, again caused cancer and disfigurement.
Right, the Strategic Hamlet Programme. In spring 1962, Operation Sunrise.
Oh, that's a nice name.
Yeah, it is. It was the key. Was the idea that the key to victory was to separate the civilian population from the guerrillas.
Not gorillas as in animals.
They attempted to use successful experience of what the British had done in Malaya, where they had basically done that. They'd moved civilians into new villages that were protected
and armed.
Yeah. But the difference is the British had given them more benefits of moving, whereas if you like to think of it, the Americans picked them up and plonked them somewhere.
Yeah, whether they liked it
were
or not.
much worse off.
Yeah.
They didn't even ask them. This copy attempt was called the Strategic Hamlet Programme, where they would create their own self-defense force isolating the Viet Cong.
Simple reason is if the Viet Cong can't get in touch with the civilians, they can't, persuade them to join communism.
Exactly. The man in charge of it is Ngo Dinh Nu, Diem's brother, and he plans to build up to 12,000 and claims to have built 7,500, but it was nearer to 3.
I'm not sure if that means 3,000 or 3
I think
single
it was
ones.
3,000. And at first it was seeming to have an impact. But in 1962, communists saw the government control increasing, and even they said it was harder to operate.
So, a bit of an effect on them, yeah.
So some say that it only failed because Diem fell from power as Vietnam then fell into chaos, but others say that Nu undermined chances from the onset by not beginning in places where you already have support and gradually building up. Instead, he built more than America thought wise and built them in more difficult areas. The result was scepticism, and in 1963 America concluded 3,000 up and running. Of them, only 600 had adequate security.
It's not very good.
And also, there was a problem of corruption because the South Vietnamese were corrupt. They moved into worse conditions. They took things off people.
That the US had given them. So the idea being that the US sent aid like cigarettes, chocolate, booze in particular, but the South Vietnamese would just especially the officials would just keep it for themselves. So there was one bit where I think it was one of the presidents or prime ministers received over $10 million and then fled just all for himself.
Yeah. But throughout 1962, it appeared that progress was being made. Operations of the ARVN were successful.
Yay.
Very quickly, Battle of Bac in January 1963, the first indication that things weren't going well. South Vietnamese with US advisors attempted an operation in the Mekong Delta, 35 miles from the capital of Saigon, to get the communists out. The APCs in particular, throughout 1962, has frightened the communists, and these were used. But 400 Viet Cong were there, and they didn't retreat despite being outnumbered 3-1. They had rifles against helicopters and APCs, and the Viet Cong won. US military advisor John Paul Vann is openly critical of the South Vietnamese army performance. It was called in a book called A Bright Shining Lie by Neil Sheehan, who was a reporter at the time, said this.
Not doing very well.
But the opposition say that it was Vann's fault, and Sheehan has distorted the truth. But whatever happened, the ARVN had problems. 2 main problems: leadership.
Well, most of the leadership was from the French colonial army and our Roman Catholics against a largely Buddhist population, and the troops, therefore. They also promoted out of loyalty to their president rather than their actual merit.
Shown in 1955 when Diem came to power, and he used loyalty to crush gangs. The emphasis, the second problem, is the emphasis on avoiding casualties. You don't want casualties in reliable units.
Otherwise they get demoralised and don't perform as well.
Yeah, exactly. And Kennedy was told that the battle was a blip, but was it? Battle of back there. To aid South Vietnamese, Kennedy had created the Military Assistance Command Vietnam, or
MACV,
led by, at the time, General Paul Harkins. He was optimistic about Diem's regime, which showed in his relentlessly upbeat reports.
Relentless.
Even if they weren't true, to be honest. Other agencies like the State Department, however, were more critical and less confident, which leaves a variety of reports with Kennedy. The last section, I know that we're taking very long to do this, is the significance of the assassinations of President Diem and Kennedy. Very quickly, lead up to Diem's assassination. In summer 1963, the spotlight shifted onto the government and Diem's regime instead of the communist struggle, really, mainly because of the Buddhist crisis.
Indeed, the Buddhists had started setting themselves on fire because Diem was being very persecutory to them, so he would give Roman Catholics things that the Buddhists weren't allowed to get. So it starts setting themselves on fire, which is not good.
Also, DM is branded as an American puppet. This creates a problem because he can't take American advice, even if it's good, which makes him... because it will make him what the Communist Party say he is, which is an American puppet. And even some of his own people say that. May 1963, at Hue City, the ancient capital... Hue, sorry. The ancient capital of Vietnam in the south. There are parades waving Buddhist flags. It's seen as a challenge to Catholic DM, and security forces ended in violence, with DM insisting that they were tools of the Viet Cong. June the 10th, 1963...
Thick Quan Duck.
A Buddhist monk
or
goes
as we
onto
know
the main
him,
street and sets fire to himself.
Or as we know him, Crispy Duck.
This is called self-immolation, which goes... That's so disrespectful.
I know, I'm sorry.
Quite fun.
But
this goes out on Prime American television. Madame Nu, the wife of DM's brother...
sister-in-law, I believe?
Yeah. Dismisses it as a bunch of barbecued bones, or monks. The attitude... It questions why are Americans supporting a government that are horrible.
Mean.
Escalating protests shown. August 1963, Nu makes South Vietnamese special forces to raid and arrest monks with raids on pagodas.
Like a temple.
They're seen as troublemakers. Members of the Kennedy administration at junior level come to the conclusion that DM is a liability. These are the juniors. You must emphasise that.
Junior.
And so there's a new ambassador in Saigon, Republican, Henry Cabot Lodge. He's a Republican because they want to have inter-party,
bit
or
of cooperation.
bipartition is what it's called, apparently, policy. Lodge concludes that DM's a liability as well. ARVN generals approach Lodge through the CIA about creating a coup, and this is communicated with Washington in August. The juniors are the only ones there. That's very simplified, but yeah. Roger Hillsman drafted a telegram encouraging the coup, but when the top men get back, they're absolutely furious.
Not very happy.
So the South Vietnamese got nervous and didn't go ahead, yet still the American commitment was questioned, arguably. September 1963, Kennedy interviewed on CBS.
Main American television network.
He's emphasising the continuing commitment in South Vietnam. He also said that the war couldn't be won unless DM reformed his government and broadened his base of support, dropping his brother. But if DM did this, he would look like an American puppet, so...
It's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't.
October 1963, ARVN generals, another different group, indicate to the US they're prepared to overthrow DM. It depends on Kennedy's reaction. They aren't encouraged, but they aren't discouraged.
Very important.
It's a bit like the same as... They didn't say no, which technically means yes, really. Lodge was kept informed by the CIA as events move into November 1963. In November 1963, a coup is carried out. Lodge suggests to DM exile, but he refuses, and DM and his brother fled. The army captures them. Generals concluded that they should be executed, and the hope was that their replacements would be better at waging war, and they died in the back of a van. Kennedy was shocked about what happened to DM. It deepened US involvement because Americans now had a moral responsibility. That's very important.
They kind of agreed to do it, really.
Yeah, so it's kind of their fault if Vietnam now goes down the pan because they technically helped kill the leader, sort of.
Meh.
DM was a political leader and his policies were damaging to the United States, but, you know. It was also suggested that Nu had come into contact with Hanoi, so you could say they signed their own death warrants. If he did do a deal, one condition would be ditching the Americans. 3 weeks later, Kennedy was assassinated.
In Dallas.
In Dallas, and power was automatically left to Vice President Lyndon Johnson.
LBJ.
The question that comes up is, what if he had lived, Kennedy? That is, no one cares about DM. If he had lived, there is a debate to whether he would have gone into Vietnam, had got Vietnam into all-out war. Arguments for, Connor.
Well, he stopped short of combat troops, so he never actually sent active troops into South Vietnam. There is anecdotal evidence with conversations with others, i.e. Senator Mansfield, that said that he wasn't really prepared. He indicated to various people that his readiness to withdraw, once I can get re-elected, I can get out, is one of the quotes. Yeah. And then you got the NSAM 263, whatever that means.
NSAM 263 in October 1963, which was a decree or an order to withdraw 1,000 troops by the end of the year.
Advisors.
There are lots of NSAM things coming up, especially in Johnson's time, so that's very important. And last but not least,
Robert Mcnamara retired from office in 1968, so a bit later, and he never interviewed until his memoirs. He said, in retrospect, had JFK lived, he never would have got into war.
But the arguments against are plentiful. In JFK's time, 900 personnel became 16,000 in the 2-3 years that he was there. NSAM 263, the withdrawal was predicted only on the success in South Vietnam. Also, he rejected neutralisation proposals of Charles de Gaulle.
French guy.
2 days before Kennedy's death in November 1962, there was a meeting in Honolulu.
Hawaii.
Early plans for commando raids on North Vietnam by South Vietnamese. Johnson made this into Op Plan 34A. The US had some responsibility for the Diem coup. The US is clearly unhappy with Diem. This is not the action of a country that had given up hope. The way out was that Diem was turning against the US, but instead of taking it, they got rid of Diem. That's probably the biggest argument. If they wanted to get out, they could have got out when Diem said he didn't want them anymore.
Mm-hmm.
But instead, they got rid of Diem and carried on. So that's a really
They
argument
really wanted
for
it.
Kennedy going in. 1963, the US commitment is bigger than when Kennedy came to office in
That's
1961.
that's including personnel and money.
Yeah, by far. Kennedy or Johnson more had 2 choices. You can leave and admit defeat or send American combat troops. Kennedy did everything short. But in 1963 to 4, Johnson only had these 2 choices. What would he do? We will find out in the next video. Thank you for listening.
I'm sorry for the long one.
Bye.
Giggity.